Hello, I'm Graham Smith.
I'm Abby Tarttelin.
And this is From Below the Balcony, the Republic podcast.
Thank you for joining us. Today on the pod, we'll be talking non-binaryism as applied to mixed heritage. We'll be talking the history of nationalism in the UK and whether nationalism can ever be a force for good. You can join us anywhere you get your podcasts, but also on Patreon at republic.org.uk/Patreon for this podcast and for some extra bits. And also, you can join the campaign, buy merch, get involved, donate, take part at republic.org.uk.
And in this episode, we are joined by Jassa Ahluwalia, actor, author, and trade unionist, and I should say, and star of TV series such as Unforgotten, Ripper Street, Peaky Blinders, and of course, you created the Both Not Half hashtag, and then came out with this brilliant book last year, which is looking at mixed heritage in light of your own British Indian heritage. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I think it started with a tweet. Is that right? So you saw someone talking about sort of only half or something, and your response was hashtag.
It was on Instagram. I'd sort of around late, what was it? It was early 2019, January 2019. I'd filmed this video of myself speaking Punjabi, like a comedy skit inspired by the likes of Just Rain and Guz Khan. And it was really my way of trying to communicate and assert my Punjabi identity in the world, because I felt like, just the film and TV industry was making moves to try and tell more representative stories, but I felt like I was really being shut out of some of those conversations because of the whiteness of my appearance. And so, I made this little skit of me just speaking Punjabi, posted it on Instagram, turned my phone off, went to bed, woke up the next morning with like tens of thousands of views and comments and all these messages. And one of the comments was, from somebody tagging her friend, saying, this guy's got better Punjabi than both of us and he's only half. And sort of in that moment, I sort of realized that I'm not half. This thing that I've been trying to reconcile within myself is actually being reinforced by the language that I'm using. And actually, I'm not half. I'm both. And so, the hashtag Both Not Half was sort of born in that moment.
Yep.
And it really seemed to capture people's imagination. Or suddenly I was going to events where everybody was like, Both Not Half, I really love that idea. I've got mixed, nephews and nieces, or, I'm British Asian, but actually, I feel the same because of my upbringing. And then I'd meet other people who, aren't necessarily, quote unquote mixed race, but would be like, I've got one parent who's from like the north of England and one parent from the south of England. And actually I really relate to it in a way as well. And I sort of realized there was a universal message there.
It's so simple, but it feels like it's so powerful because half sort of implies sort of diminishing in some way. And yet both is like, well, actually you're two things instead of half things. So if I can put it like that. But it seems quite a powerful message out of one hashtag.
Yes, it felt, and the funny thing is, I never actually felt like I was half Punjabi. I was sort of raised totally immersed in the culture. My dad spoke to me in Punjabi before I could even speak. I spent summer holidays in India. I was growing up in Leicester, this very sort of mixed heritage city. My mum made a real effort to like learn, enough Punjabi to discipline me as a kid. So, I never felt half, but I'd always been taught that was how I described myself.
Yeah.
And, even when we did John Agard's poem Half Caste at school at GCSE, I remember there was a lot of criticism about the word caste coming from like the Latin castus meaning pure, half caste meaning half pure. But I don't remember spending a lot of time dwelling on the half bit. The half bit was sort of like, well, obviously half. But and then in a way, weirdly, I think for a long time I felt like even like that term, like half caste, I felt like it was sort of well, there was a label that was sort of mine and it sort of applied to me, but I'd never really questioned it until I was seeing those comments and realizing that the issues I was facing as an actor, as someone of mixed heritage trying to assert my identity in my profession as an actor, was coming from not my own sense of halfness, but from society's sort of enforcing of halfness on me. And that's where sort of both not half came from, because I was like, you know what, I'm going to reject this societal conditioning or the way in which my own identity is being presented to me, and I should be like, no, I think we can sort of change the narrative.
And your book, Both Not Half, essentially is it's quite a personal story about that experience and your understanding of the sort of the bigger issues around it.
Yeah, it's sort of, part memoir, part manifesto. It's about how there's a version of this book that I tried to write, which was where I sort of donned the persona of some great, well-researched academic, and I was going to present the answer as I knew it to be. I spent about a year toiling away on that version of the book, and then sort of broke down in tears and realized that was never going to work. And then I thankfully had lots of lovely people in my life, like my mum and my sister, who were like, the reason your TED Talk was successful was because you spoke from the heart about your experiences and how your experiences led you to discover things and research and find this history. And so, the book is really a very personal journey of my own sort of search for self. And then along the way, it's about the history, the politics, the sort of cultural commentary that I encounter, and how that then weaves into my story. So it is nonfiction, but I feel, you'll be able to tell me better than me, but I feel like it reads like a bit of a novel. There is a real narrative arc to it. It begins somewhere, it goes somewhere, and it finds a resolution.
No, because I think that's the way you've written it, because it's personal, and so it is your view of the world and your perspective, and also you talk about your sister and the difference in her perspectives as well, and it becomes a very personal sort of family story. All the way back to when you were born. So
yes, yeah.
I thought that it was such a cute story. The fact that you forgot how to speak English when you were 4, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that was such a bizarre. I don't remember it, but I think a bizarre experience. For my mum.
Yeah.
Basically, I was in India I went with my granddad when I was about 4 years old to India for the summer with my granddad, and I basically was just speaking Punjabi for I think 2 months solid, no English. And then on the flight on the way back, the air steward asked me if I'd like a colouring book, and I just sort of stared blankly at her and then turned to my granddad and was like, "Ek hi kardi hai?" Like in Punjabi, like, what's she saying? And then my granddad was like, "Oh no, what's happened?"
You've broken him.
Yeah. And then when I started speaking English again, when I got back to the UK, I had this like really strong Punjabi accent.
There's an anecdote about you being in the supermarket with your mum and demanding something.
I was
as a very blonde child.
I was
from
blonde
your
as well when I was very young as well. And we were in the supermarket. My dad wasn't with us. It was just me and my white mum. And I think I shouted across the aisle saying like, "Mummy, I want a banana." And she just like panicked.
Was she worried that people would think that you were being racist?
Yeah. We were also like in Coventry, the Midlands, there's quite a lot of, like large South Asian population as well. So it was just, I think it was a bit of panic. I don't quite know how to like navigate this. Very Indian sounding white baby. And I think it would have maybe made more sense if my dad was around, but like he wasn't.
And another thing that we both really wanted to talk to you about from your book was this kind of passionate defense of engaging with ideas of nationalism. But before that, I wanted to talk to you because I am obviously also a writer, jumping on the bandwagon of my book. And my books deal with the non-binary. And I hadn't read a book in which anybody took that concept of non-binary, which comes from kind of gender discussion and activism and academia, and applied it to mixed heritage or to the many other things that you apply it to in your book. And I wondered if you could talk a little about that for our audience.
Yeah, just that little thing.
Just a tiny bit.
I think I realized like when I was, so after that first video of me speaking Punjabi, the comedy skit went viral, I felt like I had 2 options that were available to me. one option was become like some Instagram comedy influencer person and chase brand deals. And that just like, I felt like it was like the jaws of a beast opening up. And I was like, oh, I don't think I want to jump into that. And I sort of felt that there was something potent to the both not half idea. So I just took basically the summer to write a personal essay. You know, this was before the TED Talk, before the book was even an idea. And I just spent the summer like just figuring out what is the story? What has led me to articulate both not half? Let me make sense of it for myself. And in doing that, when I was writing that essay, I sort of getting to the conclusion of it, had this realization that this was sort of like a non-binary way of thinking. And I'd been exposed to ideas of non-binariness through exposure to like queer communities, and also, you know, very personally through my relationship with my sister, who's a queer woman, in a relationship with a non-binary partner. And it just made me I'm just trying to like think about the timeline now. But I was just very aware that this both not half was a sort of a non-binary way of thinking. But then when I came to and I sort of touch on this at the end of my TED Talk, I sort of talk about how, you know, ideas of being whole and multiple can apply to like lots of different areas in our lives. And, you know, I talk about I said gender and sexuality, but I didn't really go into any detail. But when I came to writing the book, I like really like went into that in like a lot more detail.
And you talked about class as well, which I thought was so interesting.
Yeah,
class dynamics, and you said racism is an expression of class inequality.
Yes,
which felt like a really succinct way of talking about.
Yeah.
You know, where if you have any kind of hierarchy or any kind of binary, then it creates room for other discrimination.
Like in a super simplified way, you know, like race as an idea was invented at a time when ideas of human equality were being pioneered. And they were like, right, so we sort of believe in human equality, but also we're enslaving people.
How can we keep some of this inequality which made us so rich?
Yeah. So if we sort of create a hierarchy of humanity, then maybe we're sort of equal, but, you know, some are more equal than others. And then you get, you know, racism, scientific racism. But sorry, yeah, just to come back to the thing of the non-binary stuff, where I really realized how that there were parallels and a lot to be explored in terms of like my experiences and my sister's experience of like finding her pride as a queer woman was after, you know, one of the experiences I talk about in my TED Talk and in the book is about my feeling of alienation at a Punjabi wedding in 2015, where I was, you know, it was like a family friend's wedding. I was having an amazing time. And then I saw this, I was on the dance floor, dancing, like having a great time. And I saw this young girl staring, young Indian girl staring at me. And I could just tell from her expression that, or at least what I projected onto her expression, was that she didn't understand or couldn't comprehend what I was, this sort of like Bhangra dancing white man. And I'd had like the experiences throughout the night where like Punjabi uncles had like accosted me trying to get me to like speak Punjabi for their WhatsApp group chats. And, you know, I was sort of being used to shame kids who like don't speak the language. And I just found the whole experience like really alienating. And this was at a time when I was trying to find a sense of home and belonging. And I was talking to my sister about that afterwards. And she sort of just looked at me and went, this is your first experience of being othered, isn't it?
I really like that about your book as well, that you say that that's what happened with your sister, because she had so many experiences of being othered.
And I really realized in that moment, I was like, wow, this sort of like one-off experience that's sort of becoming like a turning point for me that I'm going to eventually turn into a book deal is her everyday experience. And that was deeply affecting. It had a real lasting impact.
And it feels like the idea of non-binary, applied as you applied it, can be used to reconcile lots of irreconcilable ideas, as well as the idea of like, I really want to talk about my Punjabi heritage and my English heritage and how I am both at the same time and not half. But I can also acknowledge that privilege that I carry that my sister doesn't carry.
Yes.
And I,
Yeah.
So it makes you think about why people feel the need to, in identifying one way and with one group of people, does that necessitate not identifying with other people and pushing people out, and where that comes from and why?
Yeah. I think I've really the whole journey with Both Not Half has really made me deeply understand and advocate for the fluidity of identity and the fact that identity is not fixed and static. I think that was one of the big things I took away from my research, my writing, was this, that it's like a dance. It's this constantly evolving thing. And to sort of think of it as something that is fixed and static is really, I feel like that's where most division comes from, is from the trying to enforce these dividing lines. And I think this is where it sort of became quite natural that these conversations came out of my discussion of mixed heritage or mixed race history, is because actually the policing of dividing lines is where division happens, and the existence of people that straddle those lines are felt as a threat. And so, with the rise of, scientific racism, like you had, I think Sita Balani puts it very well in her book Deadly and Slick, about like the mixed heritage person becoming like the site where the fiction of race becomes visible. Because you've got this person who is like, who clearly doesn't fit into either one or the other. And that then becomes, that's why, alongside scientific racism, you have, or all race laws tended to have like anti-miscegenation laws, like, trying to legally enforce and stop people from mixing.
But if you have a mixed heritage child, it's like, oh my God, they can mate. They're the
same.
Yeah.
And it's and I think it's the this thing coming back to this, like the idea of the non-binary, is that these are all instances that or lived experiences that make it just so abundantly clear that these are just narratives. These are
and
just
it is
stories.
liberating. I think that it's all about, people are expected to conform to these very narrow sort of definitions. And this sort of gets back into some of the nationalism thing, that we think this is how you should be English, and this is how you should be Scottish or British or whatever. And if you're outside of that, then it's like, oh, that's un-British or un-English and so on. So, but you said you sort of had this journey where you sort of became aware that nationality was a construct.
Yeah.
And you said it was one that you didn't really need. And then you had to sort of stop and revisit that. I think you were sort of, it reminded me of the awful phrase from Theresa May calling us citizens of nowhere.
Yes, which I think I do quote. Yeah.
But you kind of come back around and think, well, actually, I am from somewhere and this is important to me. So where have you ended up now? I mean, you sort of, how do you define your nationality?
So it's interesting. Like, in terms of my citizenship, I assert my British identity. That is my citizenship. I think of it in very political terms of like what that means. As a British citizen with rights as a citizen, and well, I mean, we're technically, I guess, felt more to be subjects rather than citizens. Yeah. But that's me asserting my citizenship through my British, I guess, national identity. I think I also really have come to embrace my English identity, because, well, firstly, to sort of push back and disrupt ideas of what it means to be English. I think also just because English is itself a mixed heritage identity. Yeah. And so I feel kinship with that. It was a mix of Angles, Jutes, Saxons. Anglo-Saxon is a hyphenated word. Celtic Britons, like, to be English is to be mixed. So I don't actually feel weird about embracing that. But it's really, it's contextual. It's like, what am I at passport control? I'm British. Like, what am I when I'm dealing with laws which only apply to England? I'm English.
You make some interesting points about this sort of what should be the immutability of citizenship, this sort of more recent idea about stripping people of citizenship.
Yeah, so just to give a bit of context, I guess. So I was really struggling with my idea of national identity for a long time. Like when I was figuring out, around like 2016, I think I was like trying to reconcile my. Oh yeah, it's because I was doing a play, and I had to send off my biography, and pretty much all biographies that I was looking up on Wikipedia was like, so Ian McKellen is an English actor, or Sachin Tendulkar is an Indian former international cricketer, and it's like you've got your job, and the sort of the main adjective is your national identity. So I felt like it was this sort of immutable part of reality that I had, and I had to sort of have one and describe myself. And so I wanted to describe myself. I initially described myself, well, I'm a British actor. That seems to make sense. But I was like, there's this, because I was trying to figure out ways to assert my Punjabiness or Indianness like into my work. I was like, that doesn't quite. I feel like a bit of me is like missing there. So maybe I'm a British Asian actor. And I was like, British Asian's like not really. I don't think people think of British Asian as what I look like. And around that time, Riz Ahmed had just been on like a US chat show where he'd spoken about, I'm not British Asian, I'm British. This is what British looks like. And that felt really powerful for somebody that looks like Riz Ahmed to state that. But for me, it felt like I was like hiding a part of myself. And then I was listening to some lectures on like ideas, like 19th century, like the formation of ideas, because I'm a nerd and that's what what I listen to. And I came across this one lecture where they were talking about how national identity was essentially invented. In the wake of industrialization, the breakdown of traditional communities, people needed another sort of meaning, and national identities.
This part of the book was so interesting to me because I didn't know about. You talk about Whig history and Peterloo, and can you talk a little bit about that for people who haven't yet read the book?
So initially, I discovered that national identity was sort of like a construct. And as I say in my TED Talk, I was like, it's a construct that I didn't need. And so I sort of reject it. And so rejecting it was how I came to reconcile my British identity and my sort of Indian heritage. Then I come back from India and doing the TED Talk, and it's Brexit's kicking off, got the COVID the corona's kicking off, the pandemic. And I feel like I sort of care about my country. I feel like there's something to that, and I had to interrogate it. And so I went back and I sort of waded through Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities and discovered really that national identities emerged at this time in history where identities were evolving and like nation states were emerging. And it really struck me that like national identities were this sort of really powerful, imagined like technology of mind, which sort of allowed they just sort of emerged as these really interesting identities at a time when the world was evolving.
I think you said it was a national identity, a cultural technology that brings us together around a common purpose. I thought that was such a succinct way of putting it.
So and so I didn't feel like that was inherently wrong. I think it's quite useful to have something that can bring us together with a common purpose.
And like you said, during COVID, it was like, man, are we all on this rock together? We're certainly connected. If only by microbes.
We've spoken on this podcast. We chatted to Andrew Scott, Otto English, who does fake history and fake heroes, and he was talking about this idea of we. We invent this idea of we, the English, the British, and we have this whole narrative, a lot of which is just largely made up. It's kind of sort of fancy, but there is an element which is quite important because we need that sort of common story that.
I mean, and this is why this chapter in my book is called Useful Fictions, Dangerous Narratives. Like it can either be useful or it can be dangerous. And I think what I was trying to figure out was, like when Trump tried to, overturn the election result, he was criticized as being un-American. And when like in India when Modi did was I've forgotten what it was now, the sort of the citizenship, I've forgotten the exact name of what it was, but basically there was a response to the citizenship law, which was to basically defend the Indian constitution. So there were these like national responses to these sort of political decisions. And I was like, that doesn't happen in the UK. Like, that doesn't happen in Britain. Like, sort of I was like, why is that? Why don't we sort of seek to assert our national identity in defense of certain values or ideas? Or
Well, I mean, this sort of comes back to the issue that we talk about a lot, which is the monarchy. So that seems to be where that is sort of stored, you know.
Absolutely,
so that's
yeah.
where their national identity, and so it sort of lets everything else off the hook. But
and this is where I came across the Whig history thing when I was looking into this history, because because it was even like it was, you know, George Orwell says like wrote something where he's like you know, it's like a peculiarly English thing to sort of be ashamed of one's nationhood. Or I've forgotten the exact quotes.
It's something about you mention it in your book, and it was about that they wouldn't want to embrace the Union Jack. Rather, there's something about the poor box. Like
they'd feel more comfortable like stealing from a poor box than standing and to attention and singing the national anthem.
Singing the national anthem, yeah.
So what I discovered was like this Whig history idea, which is that basically in the early 1800s, where there was like a national movement towards a more representative democracy in the form of like the People's Charter, the Chartist movement. I don't think I really understood like the scale of the Chartist movement until I looked at the history and found out that, you know, they had like over 1 million signatures on their petitions at a time when the population of England and Wales was like 15 million.
Yeah, and I think you said that petition was struck down, and then rejected. They came back with 3 million.
Yeah, they came back with 3 million.
Out of 15 million people.
It was this huge movement.
And it was about wanting more representation in the voting and wanting
in Parliament.
Every man to have a vote, not women yet, but you know, it was
like the shift towards a more representative culture, and this was against the backdrop of nationalism reshaping the world and like the Americas and you know, independence movements that were happening. And so there was this real worry that from, you know, those in power that there would be this sort of like nationalist uprising in Britain. And so they realized, well, actually, what if we took control of the narrative? What if we decided what it meant to be British? And the guy who does that is Thomas Babington Macaulay, who had just got back from India, where he's quite famous. There's this famous line, which I also quote in the book, about, you know, he was there to create like a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in like thought. I don't think that's the exact wording, but something like that. But it was like the colonization of the mind, like, you know, those who occupied positions of power in India were those who could speak English and wore suits and all of that. So he comes back to the UK, and the Whigs are like, right, we need a story. We need a better, because these protests keep happening, but we need to offer these disaffected minds basically a better story. And so he writes this book in which the you know, the history of England, where it's essentially, and he's really explicit in like the opening of the book. He's like, this is maybe that's actually quite a good bit to just like, a little bit of it is where is it?
It was 155, because I was just looking at it before we came. At 15, I think the page before.
There we go. Yeah, he says, published in 1848. He sets out his intention as to how, thanks to the glorious revolution and the Whig ascendancy, our country, from a state of ignominious vassalage, rapidly rose to the place of umpire among European powers, how her opulence and her martial glory grew together, how a gigantic commerce gave birth to a maritime power compared with which every other maritime power, ancient or modern, sinks into insignificance. How Scotland, after ages of enmity, was at length united to England, not merely by legal bonds, but by indissoluble ties of interest and affection. How in Asia, British adventurers founded an empire not less splendid and more durable than that of Alexander. The general effect of this checkered narrative will be to excite thankfulness in all religious minds and hope in the breasts of all patriots. For the history of our country during the last 160 years is eminently the history of physical, of moral, and of intellectual improvement.
That's too polysyllabic for me, but I get the vibe.
And this is the sort of establishment story, if you like, of the glorious revolution and the establishment of the constitutional monarchy and the parliament and the mother of parliaments, and this whole notion that other countries look at us with envious eyes. It all comes from the same place, that we we got it right 200, 300 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
And we should hold on to that, which is quite pernicious because obviously we really didn't get it right.
And clearly that it's like a business decision, basically, to like, okay, that's what the press office is going to put out, and that's the story that we're going to tell to people.
Because basically the story then
again.
is like, it doesn't matter if you have a castle or you're basically living in poverty. The we is we are this we, and we have this great history.
Yeah.
And be grateful. And the effect of that essentially is then to mean that anybody who's critical of power structures in our country are immediately cast as unpatriotic, because this is the patriotic narrative.
But then we talk about these stories like the petitions and the crushing of the people demanding better rights, and these are rarely told. And when we hear stories, or whether it's at school or in film or whatever, about the 19th century or the 18th century, it's so much about the aristocrats, the monarchs, it's the Victorian era, it's the Georgian era, and you don't really get so much about the real story of British people, which is very often trying to resist this kind of thing. And we were talking again about the history with Andrew, that this notion that they kind of generously guided us towards this better way of life. But in fact, the people at the top, particularly the monarchs, were absolutely holding their hands firmly on the brake, trying to stop progress, whilst everybody else was trying to.
And it's
a lot of people were struggling to fight for it.
So difficult to connect to those stories about monarchs in the 1800s, because that's not what's happening to you. And it would be so wonderful to hear those stories about, the Chartists, and because that would be something to be proud about, wouldn't it?
Absolutely,
to embrace as national identity.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and that's why I feel like I do have a sense of national identity and pride, because like the history that I identify with is the Chartists and these sort of popular movements that were genuinely representative, seeking to create a more genuinely representative culture. And I sort of played with this a little bit in the sort of months after I'd come across this history, when I hosted like an online in conversation with Kavita Puri about her brilliant Radio 4 series, £3 in My Pocket, about like early immigration to the UK from India and South Asia. And I learnt about the murder of Gurdeep Singh Jagga in Southall. And in response to that murder, there was this. So I spoke about. I tweeted about. We spoke about this on the online event, and it's a history that I was ashamed I didn't really know about. I hadn't come across that before. And somebody had responded on, Twitter, calling me like a lefty bedwetting moron, and that I should go cry somewhere else. It was in the past, and I, needed to, move on, basically. And I responded by saying, actually, no, this is part of our national history. And actually, in response to that racist murder, you had like the Southall youth movement was born. And actually, that makes me really proud to be British, because that is part of our national history.
Yeah. But that same person wouldn't say it's time to move on if you're talking about the war.
Yes,
It's very selective about what you should move on from.
Yeah.
But there is this, because I lived in Australia for a long time, and they were talking about Aboriginal rights, and the right, who didn't want to get into this conversation, called it black armband view of history. And they're saying, it's all a long time ago, move on. And they're saying, well, actually, there's still people alive now that were affected by this.
Absolutely.
It's really not that long ago.
So that's a question I wanted to ask, is if you're going to kind of embrace a positive nationalism, how do you do that if you write in the book about BG, your nan, and how she came to England as a result of oppression and some impoverization by the British and colonialism, and so that's one of the reasons why she moved. I think you do kind of explain that in the book. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so if you're somebody like BG, or if you're one of her descendants, how do you reconcile? And I saying this as well from with a family from an Irish background who also had things taken off them and had a kind of war going on, and because of that violence moved over here to work and send money home. how do you embrace Englishness if Englishness is the thing that's made you have to move to England?
Yeah. I guess I mean, I'm not in any way forcing this on anyone. Also, I'm not tied to nationalism. That I think I explained in the book as well. The reason I think like national identity as a force that creates this, this common purpose is because the way in which our society is set up is,
States.
most stuff happens at a national level. I think if there was sufficient meaningful devolution that meant that, cities or regions were able to sort of determine um, how their neighborhoods were run, then maybe like nationalism would be slightly less
But
important.
it's such a good point that your discussion of national identity in the book, because obviously we vote nationally. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
when we're talking about having a monarchy and we're talking about constitutional reform, that's something that would have to happen on a national level.
Yes,
And
yeah.
currently, Reform and Brexiteers and,
Yeah.
prior to that, UKIP, are these people that are writing a story about our national identity that is convincing some people.
Yeah.
And writing a different one might be very helpful. And I know there are
Yes, yeah,
politicians
yeah.
like Caroline Lucas that have tried to do that in recent books. But
Mm.
that's kind of what you're trying to do as well, is to talk about having an identity as an English person that
Yeah.
embraces those difficult histories as well.
Yeah, I
And
think it all comes down to understanding, or the argument I'm making is that these identities aren't fixed. You only run into these problems when you think of them as these sort of static things that have to like be protected or preserved and defended. I think I use the metaphor in the book of of like a uniform. Like you'll never convince everybody to wear the same shirt, but you can perhaps accept that we're all sort of weaving this fabric like with our own distinct threads. And I think that's um for me, I can totally understand, and I'm not in any way trying to suggest that those who have experienced sort of hardship because of the history of colonialism or direct colonialism and the sort of the experience of like my grandparents, um, that they should have to sort of become like diehard flag waving like nationalists. I don't think that's true at all, but that's part of the evolution and I feel like I'm in a position where I can sort of make a contribution to that story and perhaps try and change that story moving forwards.
just,
Um,
I guess, acknowledging the trauma and carrying that with you on
yeah,
your way is not. It kind of knits together again this kind
yeah,
of irreconcilable idea of having been forced to move to a country, but then being a citizen of that country and your descendants being
yeah.
citizens of that country.
You
And I,
said, sorry, you said I think this is in your talk at Republic's event last year
yeah.
about, in the book, I'm sure as well, about how as citizens we should all decide our identity together.
Mhm.
And have you decided your identity in terms of is there a clear way of how you would describe Englishness or Britishness that means something?
I don't think there's a way I can just sort of like dash it off in a line. I think just by existing as myself, this is Englishness.
Yeah.
And I'm aware that that will be in conversation perpetually, like with everybody else I come into contact with. I think that's the thing that there's not like some tick box list of attributes or ideas that I think this is what Englishness is, and I sort of subscribe to that. I'm like, no, I'm sort of living my life as an Englishman, therefore sort of whatever, for me, part of my Englishness is the
Yeah.
fact that I speak Punjabi because of
Yeah.
the history of colonialism. There's nothing about my Punjabiness that invalidates my Englishness or my Britishness. If anything, it sort of makes it stronger because of the history of
So
colonialism.
these efforts, I mean, over the last certainly 30 years, I guess governments and people have tried to sort of define it and they do these citizenship tests and things
Yeah.
like this, but you don't think that that's kind of never going to work, is
No,
it?
I mean, I think that's just it's a reformulation of like Macaulay's History of England. It's like trying to set out like, well, if we can set out, those of us who are in charge at the top, if we can decide what Britishness is or what Englishness is, then, we can be in control of the narrative. And this is where, in my book, I talk about citizenship, because I think actually those in power want to be so in control of the narrative around national identity that they're basically like taking a bulldozer to the very foundations of it, which is citizenship, like the equality of citizenship. It is the most open aspect of national identity, or an identity that, you can acquire citizenship. My dad acquired British, he became a naturalized British citizen. Um, you know, you can't just fill in a form and sort of become part of an ethnic group. But citizenship is like the bedrock from which national identity has to be built. And you'll have cultural identity, ethnic identity, all these things will sort of then come into play and sort of swirl into this. And that's why I say it's a bit like a dance. It's this constantly evolving dance.
But you made this interesting point about the power to remove citizenship, which is that if that exists, even regardless of what you think of the person that's having it removed, and there's now a petition in Canada. I didn't realize Elon Musk had Canadian citizenship, but there's now a petition to have it removed.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I just said, well, yes, interesting, but I took your point that if certain people, because of their dual nationality or mixed heritage, they can have theirs removed, then you're no longer an equal citizen.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and it's really a modern thing. Prior to 1918, I think it was 1918, like literally the only way in which you could have your citizenship removed was if you acquired it fraudulently.
Right.
It's a really modern, recent thing, this idea that you can take somebody's citizenship away. It's become like, I think there was some lord said, it's almost become like a driving license or a library ticket.
I thought that was interesting. It was a conservative politician that you quoted in your book, and even
Lord
a
Moylan,
conservative politician was saying that you shouldn't be able to take this away. It's not like it's a driving license or a piece of, a library card, I think was the other example. And that was in reference to, people who'd become teenage brides of ISIS and ended up in a completely different country and then just taking away their citizenship. And there were several things like that had happened where people joined a foreign group and then left, like a terrorist group.
It's like this hangover, this feudal mindset that you can sort of like cast somebody beyond the walls, exile them.
It's interesting because as we're recording, there's a student in the States at university who was part of protests for Gaza and has been sent to a jail in Louisiana, and the idea is that they'll be deported potentially. And it's the same thing. If you can take nationality away from someone, you can take it away from anyone, dependent on whether you agree with them or not, or and if you have a president who is willing to do so, or a government that's willing to do so, that you can strip people of that is very destabilizing and
massively
speaks to the very homogenous ideas of what national identity is for some people who might decide upon that kind of narrative rather than the multiplicity that you talk about in your book, and that room for different ideas, people from different places with different heritage.
Which, we get this obviously quite a bit, people saying, go and live somewhere else if you don't like the monarchy, as if the monarchy and the country are the same thing, or calling us traitors or whatever, which is very stupid. But it's
such a feudal mindset to even have that as like a part of our lexicon.
Because this was the pre-nationalism thing, was that you were loyal not to a country but to a king.
Yeah.
And that was it was only, the 30 Years' War sort of led to this Peace of Westphalia that they call it, which was a treaty to actually put clear boundaries and borders. But before that, it was very much, if this bit of land happens to belong to that king, which might change because he then marries another king's daughter, your identity had nothing to do with any kind of notion of national identity. And yet has become that in this country. Certainly the monarchy is very much tied in with that, very data sense of who we are. But does the monarchy hold anything for you in terms of your identity at all? Is it something you've ever really thought about?
I think my desire to see it abolished has become a part of my identity. I don't know, there's, before I started thinking about these things with any great seriousness, I think there was some sort of, I guess, feeling of perhaps like transferred affection to the Queen, because she was sort of similar age to my grandmother, and my grandmother's always liked watching the speeches, and so maybe in that sense, and I think maybe I find it funny, and I know this. I don't need to make any sort of like anti-monarchy arguments to you, but like the idea of like continuity is maybe something that sort of was true during my childhood, because I was growing up in the 90s. Like Queen Elizabeth had been on the throne for ages at that point, and so there was this sort of perhaps this argument of there was something to having a continuity figureheads, but that's sort of becoming clear that that's just sort of like just a quirk of her reign. And actually, really, is it? And if we're living in a time in a world where it's like rapidly evolving, and
but it's an odd thing. It relegates everything else in our country.
Yeah,
everything else is less important because that's what gives us continuity. But surely our language and our culture is fairly. I mean, it continues to adapt and develop.
But it's again this thing of like wanting to stop change.
Yeah,
and I think this is the thing, like with Macaulay's history, with the monarchy, it's all about doing absolutely everything you possibly can to stop the evolution of culture, and I think that's because even like to sort of I don't know, to sort of test the boundaries of this a little bit, like with the Shamima Begum case, the radicalization and the people traveling from the UK to Syria, joining ISIS, is a part of our national story. You can't just delete it from the story.
No.
And there's another part of it that it's a knock-on of having gone there with and created a war,
it's
or
like trying
added
to
to a conflict.
It's this constant desire. I think that's why I always come back to narratives, and why I have that Edward Said quote at the start of the chapter about nations are themselves narrations. It's this desire to keep and stay in control of the story, and I think I don't think you can, or I don't think you should. I think we should. The story is what evolves or happens organically through.
But that is
interaction.
part of our story. It should be. The choosing your head of state, because it is a symbolic role in parliamentary systems. So you get that chance to renew your story and say, well, actually, as we saw in Ireland, where you've got the first woman being elected president in the early 90s, and in Iceland in 1980, is like, well, they're sort of turning another page, saying, actually, we're not male-dominated as we once were, and we are going to elect this liberal who's campaigned for gay rights and that sort of thing. So but in Britain, across all that time, and all these people were having these elections and choosing different people, we had the Queen, and that was it.
We've still got the same racists in power, because we were talking on with Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, who we had on, about the Race Reform Act came in I think 1967, something like that, and the Queen, required an exemption because she didn't want that to apply to her household. So we still have those. Those same people in power in that same royal household. But we have to wrap up, Jassa. But I wanted to ask you... I wanted to ask you about what's going on for you now, and when the paperback is out, and what people can tune into.
At the moment, I'm just recovering from the process of writing and publicizing this book. The paperback is out on April the 17th. And I'm going to be doing various events linked to that. There'll be a big, really fun launch event that's happening at Soho Theatre on the 21st of May, Wednesday, 21st of May.
Okay, cool.
So I don't know when this is going out.
I saw some clips of your launch for the hardback. It looked really cool.
It was great. We're basically recreating the book launch that I did there last year. Like the team at Soho Theatre just loved it. It was just it felt like being at like a wedding reception or something. So,
fantastic.
So
that sounds so
cool.
cool.
Is going to be like hosting again. There's going to be food, just great vibes, and we'll have a bit more time for audience Q&A and interaction.
And so people will be able to come to that and buy tickets.
Tickets should be, I guess, whenever this is going out. Tickets will be
I think this will be out late April, so people will have a chance to buy a ticket. And
hopefully tickets are still available.
And also on your website, is that where people can get that kind of information?
No, if you just go to Soho Theatre, Soho Theatre website, or via my Instagram at official Jassa, all the links will be there.
Okay, fab.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to
come join the chat.
Great. Thank you so much. So that was super interesting with Jassa. I mean, the whole story about national identity, we've touched on that in other episodes, and I think we'll touch on it more as the series continues. And it seems to me like that would be something that's interesting to think about. And I'm sure you've already thought about it, because in your book, you talk about the idea of a future Britain and what that looks like.
A different narrative of the past as well, and then imagining Britain in a different way. But I think what I enjoyed in a way, and this might sound odd coming from me, is it was less about the monarchy itself, but more about the underlying kind of issues.
It's a new thing to not talk about the monarchy for you.
Novel. Yeah. Yeah, I managed to not talk about it for a few minutes, but but yeah, it's so something, some of people listening might think, well, isn't this the Republic podcast? But it is. The whole point of From Below the Balcony is to kind of explore all the other stuff underneath the monarchy, which, sort of things like our identity and where nationalism came from, and how that then builds that sort of pyramid, if you like, on which the monarchy sits, which is really interesting.
And this, imperialism and colonialism, it's such a kind of macro topic, and of course very related to monarchy and aristocracy and that type of wealth and hierarchy. But then it affects you on such a personal level. And Jassa's book was very personal. And but then I really liked how it went back and forth between this just a story about the interior. The whole arc of the book is an interior arc and what goes on inside a person. And I think that's a really, as I said, I feel like that's a kind of new genre to talk about politics on national and international scale, but talk about what happened to you and the way that you relate to people because of these things that you carry.
This with other people in terms of the colonial legacy, for example, but Jess is really very much part of that legacy, but he's personalized it in writing that story, which is really interesting. And but it's also gone back and looked at where it all came from, and this story of this Whig history that he was talking about, this notion that the last 200 years, 300 years of our history is been a story of us creating this wonderful place, which is like the ideal that everybody else looks up to as a political system. And then bound into that is this idea that as we created notions of equality of man, such as were written into the US Constitution and so on, but which was also coming up through European politics, they then had to separate out other people and say, well, you don't count. So we're going
like women and brown people and black people.
So that we can continue to exploit you, we're going to create this sort of idea that you aren't within that sort of man bit of the equality.
And I wonder how much that has to do with economics as well, because obviously at the time they made a lot of money off having people who were very unequal, and the whole idea of kind of capitalism, and that you work for a wage, but that wage represents so much less than what your work is actually worth. And that's how somebody makes profit and builds up to buy capital and have assets.
A lot of philosophy and what Jassa said was the scientific racism, or the science of racism, where they try to justify through science differences between people. A lot of that is to do with defending the privileged position of those who are already making lots of money and have their hands on the levers of power. So they wanted to make sure that all these other people didn't start to take that away from them. So they justified it. They had, rather than just saying, we're going to be bastards, they said, this is the natural order and this is how things ought to be.
Yeah. I had a bit of a sciencey thought earlier on when we were talking about the non-binary and just the hashtag both not half. I was thinking that, well, actually, it is a really clumsy description, because it's coming from a time where they didn't know about DNA. They didn't know what a person was made of. So they said, well, look at their parents, their two biological parents, and then when you add them up, that's that person, and so that they're half
this, half that.
Yes, each of their heritages. But obviously, we know that in every cell in your body, you have the same strands of DNA, and it's so you are always both.
Yes.
And I thought, I know that's kind of a basic thought, but I just thought it felt very persuasive to me.
Well,
why should you ever call anybody half?
Yeah, I mean, this idea that because racism, I guess, assumes that race goes deeper than the color of your skin, when in fact it's really skin deep on that superficial level, and then everything else is about culture and language and heritage and so on. So it's which is a whole different.
And I loved how he applied the kind of non-binaryism to everything. And it said, he was so generous, I think, to say, I've had all these conversations with people who say, my parents from the north and one's from the south of England. And that in fact is a sort of binary that people hold in their heads that could be helped by the idea of non-binaryism. And I was thinking about my Irish family and very much, I've written those bios where you have to describe who you are. And it is a surprise to think, they always contain nationality, don't they? And I have never been quite comfortable saying British because to have Irish ancestry, although it's perhaps not as obvious as, having Cantonese ancestry or Punjabi ancestry, in that the cultural traditions aren't so different, but it's definitely a different culture. I mean, my Irish family, there are things that are, very Irish and that we grew up with and the Gaelic language that you don't grow up with if you're English. And so I in my head, I use the word Brirish now with BR and a dash. But I thought it was so interesting because that kind of thing is something that I would never think about because in this kind of homogenous story that we have in being English, you have to put aside all of those things. And it's kind of interesting thinking about America as well. I had a friend, Io, who lived in Nigeria, lived in Britain, lived in Holland, and he said he only ever was referred to as, different when he moved to America and he became African American, which is how people would refer to him. But at the same time, he would talk about the fact that people do then celebrate the fact that you have come from a different culture and you can hold on to your heritage. And we are an island of many people.
That
we're a different island.
I know the phrase British Asian or Asian British is, started to be used more, and some people reject it, saying I'm just British rather. But I think in America, they've always hyphenated these things for a very long time because obviously it's an immigrant nation, but they have sort of done it almost as a positive thing that they hold on to. It's like Joe Biden called himself Irish. I mean, it must be a long time ago that his family came from Ireland. What was interesting, of course, is that Barack Obama had Irish family as well. So he visited Ireland and visited the town where his family had come from, which it sort of goes back to what Andrew Scott was talking about this notion of bloodlines. If you go back, you don't have to go back very far. And all of a sudden you've got, even though I think his dad was originally from Kenya, was it? Or, it was. But his mum was, on his mum's side, the family originated from Ireland. So so it's a very mixed, interesting
My mum would say
culture.
that would make sense to recent presidents from Ireland. She would say, But it was such an interesting pod, and I really, really appreciated the conversation. And like you say, it sort of adds this other layer to talking about the monarchy, to talk about colonialism in the sense of hierarchies and creating identities that perhaps aren't as authentic as they would be.
And the monarchy isn't just on its own as a kind of discrete thing, or there's that weird thing over there, let's get rid of it. It is absolutely part of a system or a society which has a bunch of other issues which need to be discussed, and sort of put it into the context, you understand why it's more of a problem and where it came from. And that it did come from, talk about these sort of two different stories about Britain, the King's and Queen's story and the ordinary sort of people that were petitioning Parliament and getting arrested for it, and the suffragettes and all that history. And talking about all these different issues puts the monarchy very clearly in the people in power trying to hold on to power camp.
And makes it a much more interesting story, and one that gleans closer to who we are as a people. I want to end on a quotation from Jassa's book. Imperialism was about subjugation. Nationalism was about self-determination.
Yes, which is interesting because that is then obviously since over the last sort of 80 years or so, nationalism's taken a very different, more negative connotation. But I think then if you talk to people like the Scottish Nats and the Welsh nationalists, they talk about civic nationalism, which is more positive, which is about sort of saying, well, we are distinct and different, and we're sort of owning that identity.
It's kind of like I'm learning about when you say populism, that it can also be left-wing. That you can have popular left-wing movements and popular nationalist movements, left-wing nationalist movements.
Yeah, it's a curious thing, populism.
Would never
it
have
sounds
thought.
like a good thing. It's like, it's popular, that's good. But it's usually a way of whipping up popular or large
sort of basic
I
sentiment.
suppose it's a way of sort of generating that sort of mob mentality against the minorities. So, and where it's the kind of the rigid rule of the majority and everybody else has to, sort of buckle under or get out.
Can it ever be positive, though, having a popular movement? Because I feel like it could be.
Popular and populism, I suppose. I mean, it's all semantics in a way, but I mean, I think that, yes, I mean, you would hope that most democratic states and governments are popular at least at some point in their cycle.
Yeah, sure.
But it doesn't always work out. But populism, I think, is this notion that you sort of whip up these mass sort of angry mob type mentality against people who are then othered and sort of, there are people to blame, so let's blame them.
So I kind of would have said that about nationalism, but it, in a way it feels like it's a very interesting idea to consider co-opting the idea of speaking to people, to a large group of people and trying not to create that other in a way, or not to create that enemy, but to create that togetherness without enemy. If you look at a map
of Europe, in the 1800s, huge swathes of it was one, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Napoleonic Empire, odd places like Prussia, which then vanished, and then the German Empire. So nationalism was a response to that, saying, actually, you can't just say this is the German Empire or this is the Austrian, because there's all these other nations in there. And it's them pushing back against that, saying we want to be free and have our own identity. And of course, a lot of these kings and queens then tried to suppress the identities of people within their empire in order to exert control, which then led to lots of people, fleeing to places like Australia and America to, reestablish their identity. But so in that sense, that nationalism was seen as a positive thing. But then it sort of, blew up into a pretty horrific thing in the 20th century, and it's still, I think that's then had that negative connotation. But so it's a very interesting idea, which there's that sense of identity, which I think is really positive.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that kind of creating a British identity without a monarchy and the future of that and what that looks like. And it would be really interesting to hear as well from our audience, in comments, what they think a modern British identity would look like without monarchy.
This is what annoys me about the monarchy, is that it does suppress all that greatness that we have. We are such an interesting country, and we're told that that's the bit that we should be excited about.
Yeah.
And some monarchists say, we'll be so dull without it. It's like, well, who's the patriot now? You're saying this was just dull and boring without the Windsor family. So I think we're running out of time, but
join us on Patreon for follow-up, and we're going to learn about Republic Day and how Commonwealth Day went.
Okay, bye for now.
This podcast has been sponsored by the Human Rights Fund.